There we go. So we, of course, are a church made up of every current living generation, all the way from the greatest generation, those who fought in World War II, to the silent generation, right? Those who were adults in the years after World War II, and they had a baby boom. There was a baby boom as a result of the people who came out of World War II and the peace that happened in those decades, the late 40s and throughout the 50s, early 60s. And that generated the baby boom generation. And the baby boom generation grew up throughout the late 60s or 70s into the early 80s, and then they had children, of course. And the generation that came from the baby boomers is called Generation X. And I'm not exactly sure why they call it Generation X, other than that there wasn't a great defining feature of that generation. And they were sort of, as we're going to talk about, Generation X was kind of forgotten about. Not really, a bit neglected. But here is the point of this series, the point of looking at generations, and the point of what we're doing as a church. It says in Psalm 78 that each generation should set its hope anew on God. That's the goal of being people of God, is that we set our hope upon God and we place our hope in Jesus. And then we ask and we persuade and help the next generation to do the same, to see the hope that we have. So we tell them about God, what God has done for us. We tell them what God has done for people in the past. That's a lot of what Scripture is what God has done for people in the past. And then we say, but this story is ongoing. You, Generation Z and younger, can have a part of this story. It's unwritten, and it's for you to experience. Right? And so this is part of why I've really been championing that we begin to understand where we're at right now. And this is hard for us to understand, but let me say this, and this is what I've been saying the past two or 3 weeks, that the way our church is set up and the way we do things has to reflect who we are now, not who we were in the past, because we thank God for who we were in the past and what God has done in and through us in the past, but we're not in the past anymore. We're in 2022. So we have to go to God with who we are now and say, how can you use us now as we are? And this is the part that is challenging. It's challenging for me. I know it'll be challenging for you. That sometimes it's hard for us to understand that we, meaning whatever generation you're in, has gotten older. I'm a millennial. I used to think that, the millennials were the new generation, the current generation, the youngest generation. Not at all. We are now in our 30s, and soon enough we'll be in middle age, and we have kids. And, it's hard for me to think of myself as somebody who's getting older and somebody who's going to be in his 40s soon and all that sort of stuff. But it's what I have to do in order to embrace reality and to be used by God within the current situation. And the same is true for Gen Xers. It's hard to think of Gen X because for me, Gen Xers were my brother and sisters. And they were not old. They were teenagers when I was born, right? And so it's really, really weird to be thinking that my oldest sister just retired from her job, right? And that my brother has a son who got married and is living on his own in another country. It's hard for me to begin to think that Generation X is getting older and in fact is becoming middle-aged. And if I may, baby boomers are getting older too. You guys who are baby boomers are now, what would you say, the elder statesmen of our church, the people who have decades of experience and wisdom to lead and to share with us, right? And so that's a challenge for our church to say the baby boomer generation, in fact, are the elders now. And anybody who's older than that is by no means, am I saying, are not a part of our church or don't have wisdom and in a position to lead. Simply saying we're also now including baby boomers in that older group, in that elder group. It's hard to wrap our heads around this, that Gen Z, the current generation, is getting older too, right? And they, just turned 11, kids just turned 11 and becoming teenagers, and in fact, the older Gen Zers are becoming adults right now. Do you know another name for Gen Z, just off the top of my head? Generation Z are also called Zoomers. Just like baby boomers, but they're called Zoomers because they're very comfortable with being on Zoom and forced to be on Zoom a lot of the time. All right, okay. Let's take a moment to review the baby boomers, because they were the ones who were born, like I said, and the baby boom after that happened after World War II. Their parents were called the silent generation, and they were the ones who endeavored to live out the so-called American dream. The parents of baby boomers believed in traditional values, traditional roles. Think of the parents on Leave It to Beaver. That's the caricature of the silent generation, right? And one of the books I've been using for this series is a book called from Hayden Shaw, and he says that it's interesting that the silent generation was the first generation that was able to, without struggling too much, they were able to give to their kids, the baby boomers, safety, nourishment, education, health, and a relatively free society. And so that reminded me of Maslow's hierarchy, that triangle. Yeah, right? We've seen this before. There's a certain hierarchy of needs that everybody has to have in order to live well. And so we need air, water, food, shelter, sleep, clothing, reproduction. In generations past, that wasn't always assumed, right? That you would get that, or at least that you would get all those things without working really, really hard, right? But the silent generation was the first generation who was able to give those things to their children without struggling. There's struggle, but relative to the past, hardly, right? And so they gave the baby boomers the foundation of this hierarchy, right? And the expectation among the silent generation was my kids are going to be grateful that we're giving them all that they need to have a healthy life and a good life, and they're going to be grateful. So they're, of course, going to want to grow up and become like the way we are. Traditional roles, traditional values, so on and so forth. Is that what happened with the baby boomers? Generally speaking, no. So I did some more research, and I don't think I have a slide for this, so you can just go back to the slide that says baby boomers, Lynn. There's a theory called the reactance theory. You can hear the word react in that word, right? And it's by somebody named Jack Brem, I believe is how you pronounce it. And he came up with this theory, and I think it makes a lot of sense, that whenever a generation has a threat to their freedom, or at least perceive to have a threat to their freedom, and by freedom I mean not political freedom, that's important too, but a threat to express yourself the way you want to be able to learn and grow and manifest yourself according to what you think is right, as opposed to something being told to you or put upon you. The theory is that if a generation has a threat, a perceived threat, that they don't have the freedom to pursue their own, the way they want to understand their lives and express their lives, that they will rebel. And I think there's a biblical idea here, and there's a story that we know all too well. We can show the image there of the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Part of the reason why that story is there about Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and then God said, there's a tree of life, and there's also the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and you can eat from any of the trees except from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. I think this story illustrates this part of human nature, that Adam and Eve, you could say, represent humanity. We know that, right? They represent human beings. And God said you could eat from any tree except, again, from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. What is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? It is trying to pursue, and we'll use the word fulfillment, right? Inward fulfillment, feeling whole, trying to pursue that without God, trying to pursue that on your own, in your own wisdom. And the serpent in the story represents that temptation within us to rebel against something being placed upon us, like God telling us what to do, or our parents telling us what to do, and trying to, again, pursue our own fulfillment on our own. And so we know, obviously, that they ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and that led to their banishment from Eden and to the punishment of death. And that's supposed to illustrate that all that doing things on your own without God will bring you is destruction and death. And so we see right here in this story the rebellion that human beings have inside of us to, whenever we feel like somebody's trying to tell us how we're supposed to live or have an expectation of that, we rebel against that. And we saw this with the baby boomers. Not everybody. I don't think the people in our congregation were particularly rebellious as teenagers. But the caricature, or at least the pop culture, certainly portrayed that in the late 60s and the 70s and early 80s. For example, in the 60s, what did baby boomers try to do? They tried to find that inward fulfillment through political, social justice, right? They tried civil rights, to get civil rights for people of different races, people of different genders, equality between men and women, equality between the races, right? And they thought, this is the right thing to do, and I'm going to be fulfilled if I try to do this. And of course, we've seen in movies and such, and those of you who can remember, there was drug use, there was trying to find fulfillment in music and other artistic expressions. And then by the 70s, early 70s, we had the anti-war protests against the Vietnam War, which makes sense. They had a bunch of causes to fight for, right? And that became a part of their identity, who they were. And then the interesting thing is, by the time you get to the 1980s, baby boomers had grown up, and instead of looking for civil rights and all those sort of things, the desire towards inward fulfillment shifted towards materialism. And this is where we get the idea of the yuppies, the young urban professionals, right? The goal in the 1980s was to have it all, and because of the economic boom that was happening at the time, you could have it all. Throughout the 60s and 70s and 80s, early 80s, that the baby boomers went through these culture shifts, right, and caused these culture shifts. And I had to ask myself this week, what were they doing? And it's what I'm saying. They were trying to find, as everybody tries, to find inward fulfillment, right? And they tried to find it in all of these places. And what's the one place they didn't look? And I'm being general, right? But they didn't look to God, right? Obviously some did. I'm not saying everybody. Culturally, right? There was this focus on these different things. And don't get me wrong, I think political equality is great. Nobody should be discriminated against because of their gender or their race or something like that, right? And I think the way that culture shifted towards peace and love and that sort of thing, that was good, because guess what happened over these decades? A de-escalation of the Cold War. The Cold War between the East and West, between the United States and the Soviet Union, that de-escalated over the years, right? And Ronald Reagan got elected in the 1980s, and he was sort of a libertarian economist type guy, and that led to a lot of good economic reforms and a bit of an economic boom. And so I think that's a good thing, because that is what leads to peace and prosperity. And don't forget the technological advancements that happened in the late 70s and throughout the 80s. All of these things were good. I'm not trying to say that nothing the baby boomers did was good. Far from it. What I'm saying is, even with these good things, there was still a desire to find fulfillment in anything but God, anything but the right place. And so the reactance theory seems to have been validated in those decades, and the baby boomers rebelled against their parents and their parents' culture. But then it happened again. The baby boomers grew up, and they had children in the late 60s and throughout the 70s. And interestingly, unlike how the baby boomers were parented with traditional values and with traditional roles and with rules and guidelines and so on. As a whole, or at least in general, baby boomers parented their children with a lot more freedom, a lot more understanding, a lot more, but sadly, at the same time, with a lot more neglect. Divorce became prevalent in those decades, and a lot of kids grew up without two parents. Generation X, as we call it, grew up without the same structure as baby boomers, and yet they still rebelled against their parents. Now, baby boomers thought, surely, because of how I'm parenting my children, they're going to be grateful and they're going to want to be like us, right? No, it happened again. Generation X rebelled against their parents, and they did so in some unexpected ways. So yes, we're looking at Generation X, the people who were born from 1965 to 1980, and that means that they became adults in the late 80s, throughout the 90s, and towards the year 2000. This generation is also called the baby bust, because in economic theory, you have a boom, like a bubble that blows up, and then it busts. So the boom that we were talking about was having lots of babies throughout the late 40s, throughout the early 60s, right? But then the baby boomers had a lot less children, and so it was called the baby bust. And again, that means that there were less Generation Xers than there were baby boomers. In fact, they're the smallest of the generations. And they didn't get the kind of attention that they deserved from their parents. What that resulted in was Generation X people are a lot more independent than previous generations. But what also resulted from this neglect, either through divorce or through just not paying attention to them the way that they should have been, what resulted in Generation X people is a lot of anger, a lot of cynicism. But first, let's look at some of the historical events. This is the video. What happened here was this weird sort of combination of hopeful stuff happening. The 80s were a time of economic growth and the Cold War being de-escalated and in fact ending, with Germany being reunited, the Berlin Wall falling and Berlin being reunited and all of Germany reuniting, and then the whole Soviet Union collapses and all the countries that were a part of that became independent states. A lot of these changes were happening, and what happened here is there's a lot of hope that comes with that. At the same time, Challenger exploded, and a lot of people witnessed that, sort of like, not on the same scale, but sort of like the 9/11 of that generation, in that they saw it live. We'll look at that next week. But then there was a lot of different things, like President Clinton, who had a lot of hope behind him at the beginning because he was sort of like a younger Democrat type guy like JFK. Then, of course, the Monica Lewinsky scandal. But we also want to remember that they had a lot of technology happening at the same time, growth happening at the same time, with video games and PCs and internet and cell phones and cable TV. I wanted to use the phone. You would hear from somebody else in the house. It's like you couldn't use the phone and the internet at the same time in those years. Even though there was some hopeful things in that time, mostly Gen Xers became disillusioned. And that's where we got the grunge movement and so on. Because what happened is you think that things are going to be better, that you will be able to find fulfillment out in the world, but then you realize not really. And so this became manifested in the culture, and a lot of the things that, like TV shows and even something as silly as wrestling, became a lot more cynical, a lot more grungier. Let's take a look. So I thought that was relevant because who here remembers Hulk Hogan and good guys versus bad guys, right? That's the whole shtick. That was the whole shtick back in the 80s. In the 90s, the bad guy became the good guy. Steve Austin was drank beer and gave the middle finger, and I was a fan at the time. So I remember. But the thing is, like, that was Gen X in a nutshell. That, oh yeah, we're going to like the bad guy. He's going to be the good guy. We're going to cheer for him, right? And everything was flipped on its head, and a lot of anger and cynicism that went along with it. But so what this led to as the Gen Xers grew up is they valued skepticism, right? They valued, as we looked at, technological knowledge. They valued independence, intelligence, innovation. A lot of good innovation came from Gen Xers. All of the big companies that we love now and use came from that generation in the late 90s. Generation X is this really amazing hybrid of all of the good and some not so good qualities of previous generations, right? Basically, they're a lot more raw, a lot more real. And this affected church because there was a desire and a pursuit in the 90s to modernize churches, right? And that came from Gen Xers who wanted to be like, why do we have to do church the way we've always done it? Can't we do it? Can't we wear a Philadelphia Eagles sweater on a Sunday morning? Can I wear jeans on a Sunday morning in the front? Who cares? Why not? Do you think God cares about what we wear? Or, Hey, I'm not giving the answer. I'm just asking the question. And, okay, so for one example, there was a move in the 90s to change the way we worshipped to reflect contemporary music. And so that's where we had the idea of let's basically have a rock band and sing songs that way. That came in the 90s. And there was the idea of the emergent church, that you would start a church, and maybe you would even start a church in your own home, but then you could grow it into a mega church if you wanted to. The point being is, let's try anything and everything to try to reach people, and let's think outside the box. That really came about in the late 90s. We saw that in big churches that came as a result of that. But as I recently listened to a podcast all about the fall of a big church from Seattle called Mars Hill, it rose really to great heights, and then it crashed down and doesn't even exist anymore. And that was led by a Gen Xer. And I think what that typifies and what that exemplifies is that Gen Xers have this drive within them to do things differently, and that can have a lot of success. But if it's not if it doesn't include God's ways and His will, then it's going to crumble, right? So I'm not saying that Gen Xers have figured it all out. Far from it. No generation has figured it out, so to speak. Instead, we have to, all of us, look to God and say that everything that we try to do on our own is going to be a dead end, right? Pursuing inward fulfillment is ultimately a dead end if we don't go to God and do it God's way. Because that's simply eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That's all it is. We need to look to the tree of life, which is God, which is His gospel message, right? The gospel message is the only message that God actually uses to change people and transform people. When Paul said he received the gospel message and he's transmitted it to us, this is what he simply said: that Jesus the Messiah died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that He was buried, and that He was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures. And that is the message that he said God powerfully uses to change people, to bring hope and life to people. So yes, we should understand what each generation has gone through and what they bring to the table, so to speak, both good and bad. And I hope we have a better understanding of Gen X now to say that where do we have this idea of doing things differently? Let's blame Generation X. And I don't blame them because, in fact, I think there's something valuable to that. And so everybody needs to understand that no matter what we're doing, we need to look to God and present the plain gospel message, and that's the way forward. And so let's have Paul and Sean come. We're going to sing one last song from the 90s, and it's called My Redeemer Lives. And I think that if we remember that these generational differences are good and interesting, we should learn from each other, but there's hope. that every generation needs the gospel and we can present it to them.